light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. I never really know where these shows are going to go because they're all done extemporaneously, speaking off the top of my head. So it's kind of intuition and imagination and experience all rolled into one, and obviously a certain perspective as well. You know, in the same way that the purple cross on my face forms, it's formed by 4 purple triangles all pointing toward the center, and there's a sense in which we live at the intersection of our vertical and horizontal relationships, that which is above us and below us, which we don't fully understand, and the relationships we have with each other, the horizontal relationships. That when we bring the horizontal relationships and the vertical relationships together and put it right where I think what's considered the third eye position, more or less, that it's where our own unique individual consciousness integrates with the horizontal relationships and integrates with the vertical relationships and tries to make sense of it all, and then creates a voice, whether it's a spoken voice or a sign language voice or a pictorial voice in pictures, in photographs, in paintings, or a musical voice in notes and compositions of various of songs, of the way different instruments are woven together or played separately, or the actions that kinesthetic, I think, is how some people would describe it. A language of actions, a demonstration of being, a succession of what kind of house I live in, what kind of things I plant in my garden, what kind of activities I engage in socially, what kind of items I purchase if I have a certain amount of financial resources and go to a store. All of those things converge at the center of who we are, and yet there's a sense in which the perspective is always tipped so that one eye is framed in purple and the other in white, because there's always more than one way of seeing everything. And coming to the center point, but also emanating out from this center point, and giving to our horizontal relationships, and giving to our vertical relationships, so that we don't become like the Dead Sea, where the water is only flowing in forever until it becomes so toxic that nothing can live in the Dead Sea, because it's got such a high salt content, because the water never flows out. To allow to have the water flowing in and flowing out, so that life can infuse everything there and everything that it touches and everything around it. So I allow it to come in, I speak what comes into my mind, and I try to trust the work, because there have been so many times where it seemed too weird and unusual and didn't make any sense to me, and I was inclined to close my mouth and stop speaking and not say anything, and let these strange ideas just stay inside my head and not go anywhere, because everybody would think I was crazy if I said that, or it wouldn't make any sense, so why should I say it, or it wouldn't do any good to point this out to other people because they're not ready to hear it. All of that kind of censorship would take something that could be a gift to the world, I don't really know, and put it where it can't do any good. And yet, because I've chosen to trust the work and to put it out there, people have responded, no, that's exactly what I needed to hear. I suppose it started out with growing up in the Roman Catholic Church, but I've always been totally fascinated by symbols and meanings and metaphors, and I guess because of my autism, deep understandings. And so a lot of that was actually indirectly, subconsciously nurtured by growing up within the Roman Catholic Church. And I have enormous respect for all the nuns who were my teachers. They had a profound effect upon my life. And I guess this is just my updated expression of things that I learned from them, but also infused with my creativity and all the experiences that I've had over the years also. and the values that I've developed in many ways specifically because of them. Putting a value upon being concerned for the poor and being oriented to peace, and well, a song I keep meaning to include and keep forgetting to include, so maybe I should do it now before I forget it again. I looked on YouTube and I was on the internet and I was not able to find a good recording of it anywhere. At least not as I remember learning it in Catholic elementary school. But it was, Lord, we pray for golden peace. The first verse goes, Lord, we pray for golden peace, peace all over the land. May everyone dwell in liberty, walking hand in hand. And the chorus is what I love the most. Banish fear and ignorance, hunger, thirst, and pain. Banish hate and poverty, let no one live in vain. Let no one live in vain. Keep all people forever one, one in truth and grace. Wipe away all war and strife, bring freedom to each race. Banish fear and ignorance, hunger, thirst, and pain. Banish hate and poverty, let no one live in vain. Let no one live in vain. How many years ago was it that I learned that song and just committed it to memory? Because I don't know that I've ever seen any sheet music for it. So, but that's what I remember them teaching me in Catholic elementary school. Banish fear and ignorance, hunger, thirst, and pain. Banish hate and poverty. And I wish there was still that conviction of those nuns much more broadly around the world. Banish poverty. That when capitalism ignores that that inclusive compassion, it is sinning. It is doing damage to the human race. If it is not banishing poverty, if it is not banishing hate, and if it is not banishing ignorance by making education so expensive, that it is not serving humanity as it ought, as it needs to, because without humanity, capitalism itself will never survive. In order for capitalism to survive, humanity has to survive, and in order for humanity to survive, peace and the banishment of poverty and the banishment of ignorance all have to happen. It's kind of this understanding that either we all win or we all lose. It is really not a question of winners and losers, because the ones who try to win at everyone else's expense, without compassion, without love, without community, in the end find themselves empty and alone and with absolutely nothing to make their lives worth remembering. That I hope it felt good while you were here, because as soon as you're gone, it's going to disappear and it will mean absolutely nothing. And you will be, if you are remembered at all, you'll be remembered as an absolute failure as a human being. That you did not learn wisdom and love and compassion and generosity and kindness. You did not learn how to create and sustain and maintain a healthy community, a healthy world, a healthy human family. If you didn't learn any of that, you didn't learn anything worth knowing. And so I try to trust that the things that I share within these shows are meaningful and empowering to someone, and that somehow this is my way of contributing to the world being a better place. This is, in effect, still a public access television show, which means there is no money in it. I derive no income from doing these shows, and which of course would lead a capitalist to ask, so why have you done more than 450 of them? Well, because of the people who write in and say, it helped me, please don't ever stop. And because of the ways this has helped me to maintain a sense of meaning and purpose in life when everyone around me says, autistic, no, we don't want to hire you. You're too quirky. You're not normal enough. You're not straight enough, gay enough, white enough, whatever enough for us. You're not what we had in mind. And so I'm doing the best I can, and I'm giving everything that I can, and I'm striving to never give up. And I'm having to trust that what comes tumbling out of my mouth in my rambling is somehow helpful to someone, because anytime I've tried to improve it and be just like the eloquent, polished public speakers, that somehow my brain locks up and I can't mimic that order. I can only be myself. And which is where when I look in the mirror and hear how I ramble and how many subjects I cover in a single half hour, and what was the show really about? Well, at what point? And yet I don't know if it would be possible for me to ever duplicate a show, because they're all done extemporaneously. So I think I would have to be following a script in order to say exactly the same thing in any two shows. And because I'm having new experiences between times of recording shows, it's all of that comes into the next time that I speak extemporaneously or spontaneously, and that's where the words change, the illustrations change, the meanings change, and the conclusions change. You know, does it matter that I've experienced injustice? Does it matter that I've experienced really nasty racism at various times in my life? Well, it matters in the sense that it gives me a broader, deeper, different understanding. But it doesn't matter in the sense that none of those things became the definition of my life. None of those, I've often said in my show that none of us have to be only the sum of all the negative things that have been done to us. We can be more than that, because we have this ability to create, to generate something from within ourselves that has never existed before. And by taking what we heard from this person and what we heard from that person and putting them together, they actually included that in an episode of Star Trek that I saw recently in reruns, where Commander Data is playing the violin, and he shares this recording that he made with Captain Picard, and Captain Picard comments that you put so much emotion to it, and he said, well, actually I can't do that because I'm unable to generate an emotional context. I simply combine this person's style with that person's style. And he said, well, even the task of integrating two very, very different styles suggests a creativity and an emotionality that is kind of like an oxymoron. Saying an android that has feeling or a robot that has the ability to think. The two terms seem to contradict each other, and yet here is the example in front of him that he took two very different musical styles, integrated them in a particular way, and well, what made him integrate them that way instead of a different way? Or could he have integrated them a different way? Well, he probably could have integrated them a different way, but being an android and having the ability to choose, he took two expressions of creativity, made choices about their integration, and came up with something that evokes emotion from a being that logically doesn't have the ability to generate emotion. And that Commander Data can't feel happiness or sadness or any other actual emotion in the way that a human being feels it. And so in that sense, our emotions, problematic though they may be the best testament that we truly are alive. And of course, Commander Data within Star Trek always reaching for the aliveness of humanity, and yet without compromising the truth of his being as an android. And how do we ever bring the two together? And can the android ever become truly and completely and fully alive? Well, I guess the answer to that question was something that the authors and actors wrestled with in the movie Bicentennial Man, starring Robin Williams. That he was the bicentennial man because he was a robot who spent 200 years becoming fully human according to the governmental classifications. And the thing that always challenged me about that was that the quality or the characteristic by which the government was finally willing to declare him a human being was the fact that he was aging and that he ultimately died. And I just thought that is such a challenging characteristic to suggest as the defining characteristic of what it means to be fully human. That if can one still be fully human if one somehow has eternal life and does not age and does not die? And if that's the case, and if aging and dying are something that every single one of us must look forward to or must anticipate, that the young person needs to respect the elderly in the ways that the young person wants to be respected when the young person has become an elderly person. And that the challenge of the young relating to the elderly and having different approaches and different understandings and different degrees of patience with, can we talk about this without losing patience with each other? Or do we want to separate? And I don't talk to elderly people because I get impatient with them and they judge everything I'm doing and I judge everything they're doing and we just don't relate. And yet learning how to do that is what will tell them how to do it when they have become the elderly person trying to relate to their grandchildren who are now doing things in totally different ways. And on. Humanity renews itself by nurturing its individuals, but the individuals come in every age and description and gender and configuration you can imagine, and even some that we haven't imagined. There are people who they're labeled as having been born with birth defects, but what if we took that word out of the language and said that it was someone born with a totally unique configuration? And how do we understand what that totally unique configuration has to say and has to teach and has to do? I remember seeing one science fiction movie, which something that could be done with computer editing, video editing, and I trust was not an actual person, but it was a woman who instead of hands and feet had 4 hands, and there were some amazing abilities that character within the movie had that the rest of humanity didn't have because they didn't have that quality. But of course there were some limitations as well. The challenge to humanity is, can we combine the abilities and the limitations in symbiotic ways so that we can do things that have never been done before? And it reminds me of a quote attributed to Albert Einstein that I have framed and hanging on my wall, and I hope I can remember it with reasonable accuracy here. It was something to the effect that the one who follows the crowd will usually go no further than the crowd. The one who walks alone is likely to find himself in places that no one has ever seen before. And in that sense, our universe, even within the human intellect, is always expanding to the extent that we keep finding things and seeing things that we have never found or seen before. It gives us an ever-expanding universe, and it's always growing. At one point in time, I was told and I don't know if this idea is still out there, that's why I say at one point in time, I was told that scientists have speculated that the universe is expanding and that it will reach a certain point and then it will begin to collapse and implode on itself and then go in this in and out kind of expanding and contracting sort of way. I don't know that any of us are going to be around to see it, so I don't know how we would ever know that. But I think they've been able to do measurements that suggest the universe is expanding. But to me, that would be more consistent with life, because life is always expanding and growing. But that suggests that in some way, at some level, that kind of messes with our language and our philosophical conceptions, it suggests that the universe is itself a living entity. And what if each of us is a cell within a body in some bigger sense? And what if each galaxy is a cell within a larger body in a sense? And if we could back up far enough that we would see a body of some configuration walking around on a still larger planet. All of these are possibilities, and some people would say they're not worth thinking about, but I guess the reason I would say they're worth at least throwing out there for discussion. You know, you don't have to dwell on them, you don't have to try to drag them into reality, but the fact that we can imagine such things as it's entirely possible means that we will always have somewhere bigger to go, and something that can fascinate us, and a way of allowing our spirits to become bigger and more expansive and more inclusive than previous generations were encouraged to imagine. What Sister Who presents is ultimately all about is this ongoing living and growing and being and expanding within our thoughts, within our spirits, within our lives, within our communities, within our nations, within our world, and ultimately within our universe. At whatever point we perhaps ultimately are like Star Trek and develop the idea to travel between galaxies and meet other races and begin to construct cross-species communication and linguistic systems by which the human and the Klingon and the Vulcan and the Romulan and the Betazoid and every other species in a vast, larger universe can communicate with each other. And maybe someday there really will be a universal translator. And maybe Gene Roddenberry's conception of the universe as being very densely populated is closer to the truth than we realize. Maybe for now we're not able to access it because we wouldn't have the wisdom to deal with it. And there are many times when I have prayed not to have more resources and opportunities than I have the wisdom to manage, because it would be overwhelming, and Lord knows what trouble I might cause with all the best intentions or without realizing that I am. I work with symbols and metaphors, and I'm sure there are people who, well, there was in fact one viewer who came up to me at a Pride Fest event once and said, "I've seen your show, I think it's very disturbing. Thank you." And we both laughed for a moment, and I said, "Well, thank you. I'm glad I was able to give you new ways of looking at things and new ways of thinking about things." But I'm sure there are some people who think that having original thoughts is dangerous because it breaks down societal fabric, and in some ways it may even inspire revolutions. And yet, well, the image that I saw only a few weeks ago that I guess was drawn in the Peanuts comic by Charles Schulz, I'm not sure how long ago, it was the first time I ever saw it, but it was Linus and his blanket, and something about the truth being that anything that can be destroyed by the truth, any idea that can be destroyed by the truth deserves to be destroyed by the truth, because truth is ultimately what it needs to come back to, but a truth that is contextual and always expanding, and even as the human mind and human experience expands, even as the universe expands, that truth continues to expand also, and it must always be okay to question and to, if something can be destroyed by the truth, to say it's not so much that it's destroyed as that it needs to be reformulated, as that what needs to be destroyed is our limited notions, and what needs to be destroyed is the limited conceptions of ourselves that are not able to do all that life wants us to do. You know, to think that Mandy Harvey could sing with her disability, and to think that Beethoven could compose music with having gone deaf, and to think that Dante could write descriptions of such visionary detail while he was blind. What are the limits? Are there any limits? Only the one who will risk going too far will ever find out how far they can go. And certainly there are costs and personal investments that have to be made along the way. Not putting limits on God and not putting limits on life, and not, in that sense, not putting limits on myself, and having more faith in the possibilities than I have in the limitations.